feast beyond your wildest dreams, a banquet prepared by the hand of God Himself. A table where all ultimate celebration that awaits those who put their faith in Jesus Christ.
The Marriage of the Lamb, Part B, Marriage and Marriage Supper of the Lamb. Revelation chapter 19 verses 7 to 9 prompts two major questions. When and where will the marriage and marriage supper of the Lamb take place? The Scriptures reveals that the marriage will occur in heaven when the believers, also called church, is raptured before the 70th week, the Great Tribulation period, and the marriage supper will take place in heaven during the 7 years of the 70th week. The evidence and reasons of this view are following. First, normally the wedding or marriage or the second step did not take place at the home of the bride. One must remember that the established custom was to hold the wedding in the house of the bridegroom or his parents. The bridegroom fetches the bride and brings her to his house, where the bridal table and chamber are ready. In harmony with this custom, Messiah indicated that after preparing living accommodations for his bride in his Father's house in heaven, he would come from there again and receive his bride unto himself, so that his bride could be where he is, that is in his Father's house in heaven. This can be referred in John chapter 14, verses 2 to 3. Messiah did not say that he would come and join his bride so that he could be where she is that is on the earth. This established marriage custom and Messiah's teaching in harmony with it indicate that the rapture of the believers, also known as church and marriage of the Lamb, will not take place at the next coming of Messiah, because at his next coming Messiah will not return to his Father's house in heaven. Instead, he will come to the earth. Thus, the rapture of the believers and marriage of the Lamb must take place sometime before the next coming of Messiah, and the rapture of the believers and marriage of the Lamb must be separate events from the next coming. Second, in Bible times, the marriage was a joyous, festive occasion, characterized by mirth and gladness. The taking of the bride by the groom was characterized by mirth and gladness, which is referred in Jeremiah chapter 7 verse 34, chapter 16 verse 9, chapter 25 verse 10, and chapter 33 verse 11. Yeshua indicated the same thing when he emphasized that it is impossible to mix the joy of a wedding with the mourning of a funeral. This can be referred in Matthew chapter 9 verse 15, Mark chapter 2 verse 19, Luke chapter 5 verse 34. It should be noted that the mood at the next coming will be just the opposite of the joyous, festive mood of the marriage. The description of the next coming in Revelation chapter 19 portrays Messiah not as a happy groom coming with joyful companions to take his bride to his Father's house, but as a terrifying warrior king coming with armies from heaven to administer judgment and death upon rebellious humanity. The marriage customs of Bible times provided a festive marriage supper for wedding guests, but the next coming will provide a radically different kind of supper, a funeral supper of dead flesh for the fowl of the earth. This can be referred in Revelation chapter 19, verses 17 to 18 and 21. Third, it was customary for the marriage supper to be held at the home of the groom or his parents, not at the home of the bride. In Psalm chapter 45, verse 14, we read, "The bridegroom escorted the whole wedding party, now including the bride and her companions, to his own or his father's house for the marriage supper," which can be referred in Revelation chapter 19, verse 9. The wedding feast was normally given by the father of the groom. Moreover, Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 to 4, indicates the same thing. In harmony with this custom, the marriage supper of the Lamb should take place at Messiah's Father's house in heaven, not at his bride's dwelling place on earth. This militates against an earthly marriage supper of the Lamb. Fourth, the marriage supper began on the same night that the groom took his bride to his father's house and consummated their marriage through physical union. After the marriage was consummated, the groom announced the consummation to his friend standing outside the bridal chamber, which can be referred in Psalm chapter 19 verse 5 and John chapter 3 verse 29, and the announcement was then delivered to the wedding guests who had already assembled at the groom's father's house. Upon receiving this news, the guests began to feast and make merry. Thus, the marriage supper began very shortly after the groom brought his bride to his father's house. In harmony with this custom, The marriage supper of the Lamb must begin very shortly after Messiah takes his bride, the believers, to his Father's house in heaven at the time of the rapture. Since, as noted earlier, the rapture of the believers and the marriage of the Lamb will take place sometime before the next coming, and since the millennium will begin after the next coming, which can be referred in Revelation chapters 19 and 20, it appears that the millennium will not begin very shortly after Messiah takes his bride, the believers, to his Father's house in heaven at the time of the rapture, and the marriage supper of the Lamb will not, therefore, take place during the millennium. Fifth, the Old Testament teaches that during the millennium there will be another marriage supper, different from the marriage supper of the Lamb. This millennial marriage supper will be associated with the second marriage of God and the nation of Israel. At the beginning of Isaiah 25:6, a passage describing the blessings of the future millennium, Isaiah declared, "And in this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees." The word for feast in verse 6 is the same as that used for the wedding feast in Judges 14:10, 12, 17. Isaiah's statement indicates that the wedding guests at this millennial marriage supper for God and Israel will be all the other people living in the world at that time. Isaiah was speaking of a future time when, after God's worldwide judgment, his people in Israel and other nations will feast together in peace and prosperity. This is the 1,000-year reign of Messiah. The background behind this millennial marriage feast is as follows. The Old Testament teaches that God betrothed Israel, that is, bound the nation to himself as his wife, through the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai, which can be referred in Jeremiah chapter 2 verse 2 and Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 8. But Israel repeatedly broke the covenant through spiritual adultery, which can be referred in Jeremiah chapter 3 verses 1 to 3, 6 to 9, and 20, Ezekiel chapter 16 verses 32 and 59, Hosea chapter 1 verse 2, chapter 2 verses 2 and 5, chapter 3 verse 1, chapter 4 verses 12 and 18, chapter 5 verses 3 to 4, chapter 6 verses 7 and 10, chapter 7 verse chapter 4, verse 8, chapter 9, verse 1. God divorced Israel, but not permanently, which can be referred in Isaiah chapter 50 verse 1, chapter 54 verses 7 to 8, Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 12. He did not regard the divorce as a termination of his marriage with the nation. This can be referred in Jeremiah chapter 3 verse 14. God has been judging the nation for its adultery, which can be referred in Ezekiel chapter 16 verse 38. Through this judgment he will stop Israel's unfaithfulness, calm his fury, and lose his jealousy and anger. This can be referred in Ezekiel chapter 16 verses 41 to 42. When Israel repents in the future at the next coming of Messiah, which can be referred in Hosea chapter 3 verse 5, chapter 5 verse 15, chapter 6 verse 1, Zechariah chapter 12 verses 10 to 14, God will cleanse the nation, which can be referred in Zechariah chapter 13 verse 1, love it freely, which can be referred in Hosea chapter 14 verses 1 to 4, and betroth it to himself forever, which can be referred in Hosea chapter 2 verses 19 to 20 through the establishment of an everlasting covenant. This can be referred in Isaiah chapter 55 verse 3, chapter 61 verse 8, Jeremiah chapter 32 verse 40, chapter 50 verses 4 to 5, Ezekiel chapter 16 verses 60 to 62, chapter 37 verses 21 to 28. Israel will be adorned like a bride, which can be referred in Isaiah chapter 61 verse 10. God will delight in and rejoice over Jerusalem as a groom rejoices over his bride, and the land of Israel will be married to God. This can be referred in Isaiah chapter 62 verses 1 to 5. Thus, at the next coming, God and Israel will go through betrothal and marriage a second time, and then their marriage supper will take place during the millennium after the next coming. This future marriage of God and the marriage of the Lamb have two different brides. The marriage of God has the nation of Israel as its bride, whereas the marriage of the Lamb has the believers as its bride. Sixth, it was customary for the wedding supper of Bible times to last for 1 week or 7 days. In relationship to the marriage supper of the Lamb, the 7 years of the 70th week of Daniel chapter 9 will correlate to that time period. According to this view, then, the rapture of the believers and marriage of the Lamb will occur before the 70th week, that is the tribulation period, and the marriage supper of the Lamb will take place in heaven during the 70th week.